All right, welcome everyone to the first ever ULab mental health discussion. Before we get into the good stuff, I have a few quick announcements. The next slide. Awesome. So a few quick reminders. The mid-semester assignment is due this Sunday. The assignment is on B courses and you can turn it in on B courses. Yeah, let us know if you have any questions. Hopefully it'll help guide your projects a bit more. CS3 is next Tuesday. It'll be synchronous like today, however, there won't be a checkoff. So you can watch it on video later if you'd like. Speaking of checkoffs, there is a checkoff today. And so you can find that on B courses. Hopefully I published it, but if I didn't, I will soon. And then finally, a quick reminder that office hour checkoffs are a thing. So office hours have been a bit quiet lately. Just a reminder that you all have to at least attend one. And then a reminder one last time that October 19th, which is next Monday, is the deadline to register to vote online or by mail in California. If you're eligible to vote, do so. And you can also find how to vote in every state at that URL. So today we have very special guests, Shantanu and Jade. I think they're going to introduce themselves later, but they'll be running a 3-part series on just some casual discussions about mental wellness and that sort of stuff. And hopefully we'll be putting a more ULab-y spin by centering all of our discussions on studies, actual studies of various phenomenon, psychological phenomenon, that sort. Yeah, so without ado, welcome Shantanu and Jade.
Yeah, thanks, Yi. It's wonderful to see you all. My name is Shantanu, rhymes with canoe. I'm a third-year physics major with a math minor. I'm really psyched to be here. Jade, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Jade. I'm a junior. I'm double majoring in psychology and economics. I'm also trying to minor in data science as well. It's been a pleasure working with Shantanu and Eve on this whole discussion. Had a lot of fun doing the research, so hope you guys enjoy.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, we'll be doing 3 workshops with y'all. And just as a general disclaimer, we're not psychologists, or well, I'm not going to be, Jade maybe at some point, and nor is this discussion intended to be counseling. This is just an attempt for to share with you some of the things that we wish we had been told or suggested when we were coming into like the physics area or in general as undergraduates, what it was like and things we wish we knew or had thought about. You know, our experiences and our perspectives as undergraduates and just people in general. You know, some of the things we'll discuss will have like, oh, some negative experiences or like, you know, are not necessarily positive. And we're not saying that you should be experiencing problems, quote unquote, or negative emotions. But, you know, if you happen to have experienced them or do so in the course of the next 4 years, we want you to know that they're natural and there are ways to go about discussing, identifying, understanding, and alleviating them. And as a general note, this is directly related towards like trying to target, you know, as you are ULab students. So we're hoping to base this off of like studies. And so today we'll start by reading a study. And so let's get into it. Today we're going to be talking about the importance of social relations. And this may sound like a fairly obvious topic to begin with, but hopefully as we delve into it, you'll notice some nuances or some subtleties in general. So just as a general roadmap, we're going to first start by reading the article, the study, the research paper, and then you identify, you know, why should you care about this? Like, okay, social relationships. Yeah, I know what those are. I've had those my whole life. So what? And the way we're going to talk about this is through some general trends, as well as some myths that you may have about happiness or that are common in society in general. And then tie it into like what are current events going on that could be relevant and just additional reasons why you should care about this and thinking about it and how it applies to you. Then we'll talk more in depth about the article, you know, going really into like the research aspect and the scientific process going on there. And really the keystone of these workshops is the discussion section where we hope to hear from you. And, you know, how can maybe what we've talked about be relevant to things you've either experienced or are currently experiencing, and, you know, maybe concerns you have or ideas on how you can address these things in your own life. You know, during the next 30-45 minutes, if you have any comments, questions, or concerns, please speak up. We do really want to hear from you. And we hope that you'll find this material engaging, relevant, and even motivating. You know, if you feel more comfortable in the chat than with your speaker, feel free to text there. Jade and I are happy to respond in kind. So without further ado, Jade's going to share the link to the article in the chat. And we're going to go into some breakout rooms, which you will be organizing right now, of like 3 to 4 people in each room. The idea is read this paper by yourself, but if you have any questions or if you're not sure how to interpret something, don't get caught up on it and ask those who you're with for clarifying details. And most importantly, when you read through it, however you've been taught to read through it, I've heard that ULab has already had a reading research papers workshop, which is awesome. Use those skills. Once you get through, check your interpretations and ask questions to each other. That's really the main thing we want you to do. Read it by yourself, get caught up on some of the details, and then check those interpretations with each other. So we'll see you in 10 minutes once he creates the breakout rooms.
So I don't quite know how the chat works in breakout rooms. I would suggest opening the article before you go. But the rooms should be open now.
Oh, okay. I will continue then, or we will continue then. Hey y'all, so glad to see you back again. Hopefully you were able to have some time to at least identify the important things going on. And so we're going to talk a little bit about it. But before we talk about it, we're going to have like a discussion, or excuse me, sorry. So before we talk about it, we're going to basically just talk about why we should care about this topic. And then we'll talk about the article, and then we'll get to the discussion. And that's where we want to hear what you thought of the article, okay? And as I'm giving you some context for the article and what it means and the definitions and the research, these are 2 questions that you should really think about. What exactly is a social relationship? And in what environments does happiness arise? I think those are both 2 very direct questions that you can think about on your own personal level, as well as how can you use the knowledge we talk about. Oh, sorry, I started on the wrong slide, I guess. Yeah, okay. So let's talk a little bit about like why you should care about what you've just read and just about happiness and social relations in general. It is useful to just talk about maybe some of those reasons. And the bottom line is because happiness and the trends in happiness are things that are happening to you and around you. They're part of everyday life, which goes without saying for the most part. But there are some myths associated with happiness, which I would like to talk about briefly. First of all, and most importantly, that happiness is found purely inside. I think there's also like generally this idea that, if you work hard enough, then you'll be happy enough. And while it's true that if you work hard, you can be happier, there's a difference between being happier and being happy enough for your own standards, which is something that we'll talk about a little bit more later on, but that we would also encourage you to think about in your own experiences. On a more national level, there are some trends that tie into this. One that is becoming increasingly researched and confirmed by scientists is that in developing countries like the US specifically, not in Europe necessarily, but in the US where most of us live or at least attend school, there's an increase in GDP happening, so economic growth. But happiness indexes, no matter how you measure them, are dropping in the US as opposed to other areas. So, going back to this idea that if you work hard enough, then you'll be happy enough, right? And so before we continue, and that kind of ties into like trends of, decreasing social networks, which is what you kind of see on the right-hand picture over here. If you look in the upper network that you see in the picture, you'll see that it has a lot more branches and a lot more nodes than the lower one. And this is actually taken from a paper, which is hyperlinked here and which you'll have access to after our discussion and whatnot, where they looked at what were social networks like in the US, in 1996 and before, as opposed to just 4 years later. And you can see that there's a significant decrease. And this ties into a broad literature on what is happening with social relationships and networks as technology use increases, which ties in a lot with COVID-19, being home, Zooming all the time, being on YouTube, and the rise of technology in general. I think perhaps some of you have watched the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma, which kind of addresses some of these topics. If you have not, I've heard it's a great watch. And this idea of working harder and being happier also ties into ideas of capitalism and individualism, which have been promoted for a long time, especially in Western civilization. So it's worth considering, how do these influence you? And what I'm saying is that these do influence our perception and how we learn to a strong degree. So before we go any further, I'd like to ask you a quick question, which is, when do you think people are happiest? I'm going to launch a poll here. Hopefully you can see the poll. And basically the units on these answers are years. So do you think people are happiest when they're our age, when they're 40, when they're 60, or when they're 80? And there is a right answer based on research, but maybe give you a moment to provide some answers. And also if you have any questions you'd like to ask right at this point in time. All right, I think some people are still putting in answers, but it seems like we're kind of gravitating towards the 60 range, which is really great. Oh, I don't think I've shared the results with you yet. I will share them now. All right, so you can see that as well. But the bottom line is it seems like y'all are pretty close to what's accurate. So the closest age actually is 80. And I suspect the reason many of you put 60 was because of the idea of retirement, which is in part true. But researchers have looked at this and they find that the data shows that people are happy when they're 20, and then happiness indexes decrease in the next 20 to 40 years before increasing to above 20 levels in the 70s and then into the 80s. And so kind of has to do with this idea of why are people happy, right? And so some people may say, oh, it's because of their work and how established they become over time and how much they're earning. That may be partially true, but there's another factor which I hope you can agree with me from intuition is, the social network, having a family or like having grandkids at some point, etc. And this is different for everybody, but as a general trend in the US, this is a true statement. All right, thank you all for answering that poll. And now let's talk about the article in specific. So, this article or this study is titled Very Happy People by Ed Daner and Martin Siegelman. And it's a very seminal work in this field of psychology, published in 2002. So it's not a very old piece of research. This is very relevant and very modern. Specifically in terms of relevance, this was a semester-long study of 220 undergraduates at the University of Illinois. So you have to realize this is not too different from you and I, right? This is a group of people who are also undergraduates in a time not too long ago. And one of the focuses of the foci of the researchers is what is going on with the happiest 10%. Before we move any further, I'd like to ask y'all, and you can respond out loud, which I'd be thrilled to hear your voices, or you can respond in the chat. What were some of the questions that the researchers were trying to answer? Or what did you, or maybe your group, identify as some of the questions?
I think one of them was they were trying to find a commonality between all happy people, a key.
Yeah, and
go ahead. Was someone else speaking? I didn't mean to cut you off if you were. Yeah, thank you, Natalie. That's precisely it. You hit it on the head. There is one other thing, but that is definitely, perhaps I would say the most important thing, which is they were asking, is there a key to happiness? Something that is necessary and sufficient as an activity or a condition or a mental perspective, right? So something that is not only exists in all happy people, but is there, not only exists in all happy people, but without which people are not happy, right? There was also another question, which I think is very important, which is, are the happiest people always happy, right? So those are two pretty key concepts, and we're going to talk about them a little and come back to them in the discussion itself. So, in the actual nitty-gritty details, conceptually what's going on. First of all, there's some methods for selecting the happiest 10% of people. And the way they did this was they had two filters. Each filter consisted of taking some data and divvying it up and looking who was most satisfied with life, who had a global self-reported effect balance. And so these are all technical terms, but we can talk about them later if you would like to know more. And I'll also have links to some of them later on. The main thing you should take away from this is that in the social sciences, it is possible to quantify and organize data about, emotional, or what perhaps would be considered emotional qualities in hard sciences. And if you're interested in knowing more about these types of filters or scales or balances, I would recommend you to look at the MIDSS, which is the Measurement Instrument Database. It details all these things. One thing that is really interesting is how the data was collected. And hopefully these are things you kind of like looked at while you're skimming through or reading the research paper. These are good things to identify. What are the methods? How is the data collected? And then the conclusions or the findings. In terms of collecting the data, there were several types of data reports taken. There was peer reports, global self-reports, and daily measures on multiple variables. Some of those variables included emotion reports, exercise, and even religious activities. So for example, with the peer reports, they would ask people who knew those study participants well about, does this person seem like they do this type of activity often? How do they interact with you, etc. And on more of like the self-report type of data, one thing that was really interesting, for example, is the emotion reports were done by texting the participant every 20 to 25 minutes and saying, what is your scale of happiness or like satisfaction, etc., on a scale of 1 to 10 right now. And they would just do that several times throughout the day. So let's talk about the findings a little bit, because this is really what I really would like you to take away from this article. And this is almost a direct quote from the conclusions, which hopefully you look through. That's one of the best parts to look if you don't know what you're looking at in an article. Social relations do not guarantee high happiness, but it does not appear to occur without them. Right. So, what does this mean for individuals? Because the researchers found that people who spent the least time alone spent the most time socializing were the happiest. That's not a note to introverts that you're doomed to be unhappy. Socializing means many different things to many different peoples, whether it's like curling up on a couch next to your family, or there are also other types of socialization, such as touch and nonverbal socialization. And these play a critical but oftentimes underrated role in society. And they're like really evolutionary bases for why touch is important, why look is important, and body positions. A lot of these are detailed really well in a book called Born to be Good. So that's one of the big findings. And the other one is that very happy people were not always happy or, ecstatic. They weren't like always the happiest, but they were consistently happy. So that's something really important to remember. I think it's very easy on a personal level to look at, quote unquote, everyone else and say, oh, everyone else is always happy, or, oh, everyone else doesn't struggle with problem sets, for example. But what you need to realize is that the people who are happy or consistently happy are not necessarily always happy. Those who are happiest assign their mood like a 7 to 9, but never a 10. They occasionally did report having negative experiences, and even just very negative experiences, which is like considered a 1 or a 2 on a 1 to 10 scale. All right, so we'll do a second Zoom poll now. I know I've been talking for a while, so if you have questions or you'd like me to go back, please do let me. We'd like to get a discussion section now, which hopefully will be the most interesting. I'd love to hear from you here, your opinions on happiness, like, from before this, or maybe some thoughts or problems you have with what I'm saying now. So before we get right into that, I'm going to share another poll, which is, what is your understanding of happiness? Which of the following factors do you think correlate to happiness? Like for you, like think about it just for you, not for everyone. For you, what do you consider important to your own happiness? And then we'll talk about what statistically and scientifically has been found as stated in the article you just read.
So the word affect is being used in the research paper, and now here in this poll, what do you mean by that is affect? Like visual, like facial expression affect? Or no?
That is a fantastic, and I think it's a really great question. So affect intensity refers to how intensely people experience their emotional responses.
Oh, whether good or bad, right?
Does that make sense, Natalie?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yes, and how good. Yeah.
Wait, can you say that again?
So as you're answering this, affect intensity refers to how intensely people experience their emotional responses. The reason that we measure affect intensity is because it's difficult to say, oh, when a person says they're very happy, they're not being biased. It's difficult to say, is what a person experiences what they actually think they're experiencing? And so the measure of how off that is, conceptually, the measure of how off that is what we consider the affect intensity. Unless Jade wants to chime in with a better or clearer definition.
Yeah, I like that definition. The emphasis is really just on the intensity. People all feel emotions, but affect intensity is more, about just how intense, how, to the extreme you feel the emotions.
Right. So it seems like most of you have voted. Thank you, Jade, for confirming and clarifying that definition. It seems like most of you have voted, and just look back through your answers one more time and think, what right now, or what earlier today, or what tomorrow, or last week when I had a bad experience and I was down the whole day, what was it that made me feel that way, right? So I'm going to close the poll now, and I'll share the response. And what I see is actually really encouraging. In the sense that we all kind of hit some of it on the head. What the researchers in this study found was that these bottom three factors, conscientiousness, openness to experience, and affect intensity, which again is how intensely people experience their emotional responses, how much they feel their feelings, really are statistically significant and correlate to very high happiness. Everything else they could not prove for this undergraduate population was statistically significant in correlating to high happiness. So let that sink in for a moment, because a lot of these are things that, like, at least personally, I would value. For example, if someone asked me if I cared about my GPA, I would say, yeah, I care about my GPA, right? And if I get a bad grade on a test, then that's definitely going to put me in a stressful situation. Not to say stress is bad, but like there's definitely some different categories here that are of relevance, right? I think one that is also like particularly off-putting is the number of objectively positive and negative events. I originally, before I read this article, thought that, oh yeah, that's definitely something that, would matter, right? Like being able to weigh on a like almost scientific or numerical scale. But what's really shocking is, in general, in other studies that have been done, only 10% of happiness is related to income and wealth. So let that sink in for a moment and think about like what that implies, like in the span of a person's life, why 10% of happiness might be due to income and wealth and not more. And this kind of leads to the next question, which is, does high happiness require an absence of negative experiences? So we talked about this a little bit before. I'd be glad to hear if any of you have any opinions based on what you read or your own personal experiences or what we've just talked about. So does anyone have any ideas about, does high happiness require an absence of negative experiences?
Yeah, if I can speak for a moment, like just want to get a comment out there. Yeah, so
yes, please do.
Yeah, high happiness definitely, at least in my opinion, requires some negative experiences because, if you consider a life with just a pure one state, like you're in your happy state, you're not happy relative to anything. To have some negative experiences, and that's not to say like tragically negative, but it gives you some perspective on what your life is like.
Yeah, definitely. I guess this is the idea of, thank you for sharing. This is the idea of like, right, chocolate tastes better once you've had broccoli or something like that. Does anyone have any comments on what was just shared or any other opinions?
Have any of you guys watched The Good Place on Netflix?
I haven't started it yet, but it's on my watch list.
Well, not to spoil anything, but essentially there's this like theme that goes like, when everyone lives a life of suffering, having an afterlife full of good seems ideal, but when your life is all good, there's nothing really else that'll make it better, and in a sense you're living in a state of like dormancy. And like I kind of related that to how in order to be like happy you need to experience something that's like that's going to bring you down.
Yeah, I think that's like a really deep thought, and I think that that's very applicable and very true. And so I think, both of you have kind of hit the nail on the head, in the fact that we're finding increasingly in the research that's being done that happiness does not come when you have an absence of negative emotion. And this was like a very long-standing theory in psychology that, to be happy, you can't be unhappy. But now we're finding more and more that struggle and negative experiences, if you can push through those and learn from those, that leads you to higher planes of happiness. One really profound example of why this matters, like, not just for a college student and someone who may feel alone and isolated now, or struggling in classes, or, working a part-time job and also in college, which is immensely difficult, is imagine like in the future, perhaps you have a significant other, and at some point, so when you're 60, 80, 90, you become a widow or a widower. That grieving process has been studied by our very own by our own Professor Keltner at the University at UC Berkeley. And he's found that when people in the grieving process find the positives, when they laugh and cry in increasing amounts and equal amounts during that grieving process, then they get through it faster and they come out of it more resilient, and they become they play a larger part in the community afterwards. So there's like this idea of being stoic, right? Of not letting emotions out, or of taking things and keeping them bottled in, or, oh, something bad happened, I have to feel bad about it. But viewing those in alternative ways, being able to find the laughs and the happiness in those can lead to greater outcomes. So let's move on to a few other discussions near the end. Oh, did someone want to say something? Natalie?
Yeah, I had a question about that. I wasn't so sure about your summary. What was that whole spiel about? Saying that when you're in the mourning process or in a grieving process, you should think about the good times. Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, so in the study that was done, they brought in widows and widowers, and they asked them to spend 10 minutes talking about their significant other. And the widows and widowers who laughed more and cried more during that discussion, who weren't as closed or as clenched or angry
Okay.
about it, they were to recover or like get through that process fast, and they also ended up living longer lives.
Okay, so going through all the feelings
Does that
of
answer
the
your question?
happy and the sad. No, I thought you were just saying think of the good times. But in my experience, like with breakups or other like sad things, deaths in the family, I realized like I have to go through a week of intense mourning and then I'll be fine. So like, yeah, good and bad, I feel works for me. But just understanding it's part of the process.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Natalie, and for clarifying what I said, because I realized it was not very clear. So thank you for that. All right, so we're coming to the end, near the end of our time. We have one really main point of discussion left, and then we'll talk a little bit about what you can maybe take away from what we're talking about, apart from what we've already suggested, and we'll go from there. So, this is a question that hopefully you should be able to answer after reading the article. So I'd like to hear, maybe you can type in chat or you can say it verbally, what is a social relation? And how is that different from a relation? When people say relation, you're like, oh, it's between two or more people. But that's not the same thing as having a social relationship. Does anyone have any ideas what exactly a social relationship is? Are there other types of relationships, or can you think of any other types? Maybe that you experience in your daily life or previously did?
I feel like social relationships are relationships with people that you like commonly interact with. You talk to them. It's like your friends, family, significant others, or sometimes even like teachers or mentors, people you like interact with on not necessarily a daily basis, but you talk to them a lot. And relations can just be like you're related to your cousins, right? But you might not talk as much, or like you're related to some other people, some family, or someone. That's a relation, but that's not a social relation, since they don't really contribute to you as a person on your like daily basis.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Rob. I hope I've said your name right. Forgive me if I didn't. But yeah, man, y'all are a pro group of students and people in general. Y'all have been hitting these on the head. But that's exactly what it is, right? So I have a definition here, but I'm not even going to read it out loud because you just said it perfectly. So having said that, let's move on a little bit then. So going off of what was just said, sometimes people, but that's not the same thing as having a social relationship. So one thing I'd like to ask you, and I'd love to hear some responses, but if not, at least consider it, in your own context, is if you know someone in the classroom, or right now the classroom, right? Does that mean you have a social relationship? So imagine that, you're on campus and you're going to, physics class every Tuesday and Thursday or however, and you see 20 people in that class, and maybe you talk to them once or twice. Does that mean you have a social relationship? Or even now, if you're maybe in a study group for a class? Or perhaps, I realize it is difficult for freshmen because they haven't had that on-campus experience. Maybe some of the older people here could share their opinion.
I can start us off, and anyone else is welcome to jump in. So I guess I know we are saying classroom, but I'm reading this and just think of an example as clubs, right? So we can join different kinds of student organizations here. And I just remember in sophomore year, I joined this business group, and then it's, you get together and you write like investigative pieces about some business topics in Berkeley. And I was in that club. I knew the people. I go talk to them, I say hi, but looking at this, like, I don't think I really had a social relationship with them. I didn't feel like I was able to communicate, you know, or emotionally. I didn't feel like there was, I'm really getting to know the people. And I think because of that, looking back, because of that, it made my experience during that semester in that organization way less enjoyable. I didn't get to know the people. Like, I didn't feel, you know, supported when I'm presenting my things. And I think it would have been way more fun if I tried to maybe build a social relationship with them instead of just taking it for granted. You know, I thought I was in the club, they're automatically my friends. And yeah, I guess that's goes along with the point.
Like friendship is necessary for it to count as like a social relationship, whatever that means. And I think it's like, so like Jade said with the club thing, some clubs when you join, at least, like if they're not social clubs, it's like based on utility or based on like you want to get something out of it. Once that stops, once you stop wanting to get something out of it, and moreover, once you're like allowed to share emotions, I think that's what like brings it up to the level of like a social relationship. But I don't think just knowing someone in a class, obviously, you know, even the frequency of seeing them might increase the chances, sort of like an activation energy for you to have a social relationship. But I doubt that like just frequency does something. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Ibrahim. I think that, yeah, and thanks, Jade, for sharing your experience. That's definitely so true in clubs and in the classroom. I think personally, when I was in like physics 5A, or perhaps some of you are taking 7A, I found out like it was really great class, but I was like super ambitious. And I was like, oh, I can do everything on my own. Like, otherwise I'm not really learning it, right? Because of that, I really didn't necessarily talk with as many people, and I didn't feel connected to them. And I'm not saying, the point of this presentation or discussion is not to say that every relation you should have should be a connected social relation. The point is to say, consider what your relations are and whether they should be social or not, because there are benefits to having a social relation. One of the benefits I found as I started to make closer friends in my physics classes and community was that I felt more connected to the topics in general. There can definitely be an isolating feeling when you're working on problems and you get frustrated and you don't know how to attack that problem or deal with your own frustration or that feeling, especially now when we're in quarantine, which is why I wanted to bring this up. And the British Medical Journal found that not only are there different types of relationships, but they have different values and impacts on you. Specifically, happiness increases due to sociality, which we know occur because we just talked about that in our research paper, don't occur between coworkers or in a professional relationship. So that's why we've been discussing this. It's important to consider, do you have a professional relationship or do you have a social relationship? And when do you want to have which one? Another note to make is that mutuality is important in taking a professional relationship and making it a social one. So we're going to talk a little bit about how you move from like a professional or non-existent relationship to a social relationship. This is kind of like just moving forward. How can you maybe use some of what we've discussed today if you find it relevant, important, or engaging to based on your own personal experiences or like philosophy? But before we do so, I do want to stop and ask if you've had any thoughts during the discussion today or in general about these topics. I know that like when I'm exercising, I tend to become particularly philosophical about like why I'm doing physics or who am I doing physics with? Does this matter? Is this relevant? I see Yi smiling because we've had those discussions. You know, so if any of you have had those, or if you find that you do start having those, this is material you can always refer back to. But, you know, if you've noticed anything about your day or your life or how you approach meetings or classes, right? Think about, for example, when your GSI is, you know, in discussion or leading discussion, is your face cam on or is it off? And is that important? Does it increase this feeling of human to human interaction or not? Yeah, so I'd just like to ask of you if you have any questions or concerns or opinions that you bring to this either now or from before. And then we'll talk a little bit about how you can use what we've talked about today.
Yeah, I guess I could comment on something. So I do think about like exactly what you said a lot, or I used to more. And I always think like, oh, am I being social enough? Or if I'm not, will this affect me? And like, will I be a good physicist later on? But then like I notice like I looked into a lot of like Einstein's life, and he was pretty social. But then like there's people like Newton out there, and Newton was like the most antisocial like person you'll ever meet. And I read a lot about him, and he seemed to be a very foul person. So it's like I don't know. No matter like which path I choose, I think like what I want will become more like, oh, okay, I'm doing this wrong. Let me fix that. Or I don't know. I think I'll learn as I move along in my physics career. So I'm not sure if there's a correct path. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that was so true, Gurpreet, in the sense that it works out differently for different people, and people find success in every type of approach. And so like the beauty of it is like not finding every approach, but finding an approach that works for you. And it's so funny that you mentioned Einstein, because I think one thing that was really well known about Einstein is that he would always take time to go outside and, you know, go for walks every day, regardless of everything else that was going on. And that kind of ties into some of the actions that we encourage you to take. You know, in-person interactions, even now during quarantine, going for socially distanced walks is a great idea. There's so many psychologically and scientifically proven benefits to being outside. Even dinner chats or playing board games, if that's something you're interested in. I guess alternatively, if anyone plays like Mario Party or Mario Kart or Smash, those are all great ways to do that as well. Yeah, but so like, you know, in-person or quote unquote in-person interactions are great. Because of the quarantine/virtual setting, attending group events is a really key way or really helpful way to socialize or like take professional relationships and make them more social, such as ulab, right? So things like what you're attending now, SPS, Society of Physics Students, Maths Undergraduate Association, anything and everything, departmental stuff, and in general, events that are going on. And I would say like in the classroom, reaching out through Zoom chat and forming study groups. I think you'll find that people are particularly receptive during quarantine to being in groups. Yes, Aditya has also plugged the Physics Gather, which is a great space as well that you can check out if you're interested. But yeah, as I was saying, you know, when you go outdoors or when you do some of these types of events, it helps you to practice empathy and compassion and have a sense of awe, which makes your problems feel smaller in the context of whatever's going on in the world in general. And that can be really helpful in terms of taking what seems like a ridiculously intense 11-part physics problem or math problem or engineering problem and saying, okay, let's take it one step at a time and remember that there's lots of resources to help us address this. One other thing that hopefully you'll take away from this is to make sure you acknowledge when you're feeling unhappy, whether that's during difficult problem sets or feeling like you are having imposter syndrome or feeling even loneliness, which is increasingly happening based on studies and just obviously your common intuition during quarantine and COVID. And to remember that that feeling is not just you. That's really great. And that's one thing that practicing and strengthening social relationships can help you with, is remembering that there are other people who are going through similar types of things, or you know, things that complement and supplement your own experiences. I'm going to take a moment to pause and look at the chat, since it seems like there's a lot of messages there. If anyone wants to talk,
they're talking about playing Among Us, which you should absolutely do. It's great fun.
It is. I seem to find that there's a problem with the servers never connected.
Yeah. If you guys want to keep talking logistics, this is exactly what the random channel on Stack is for. Please use that more.
So I guess having said that, we will move to the last slide as we're wrapping up on time. So this is almost perfect, which is, we just want to point you towards other articles you can read, websites that have tons of like empathy and compassion and general emotional development and intelligence practices. If you know this is something you feel like, oh, I don't really know how to handle my emotions, or I get upset over really little things and I'd like to work on that. As well as like relationships in general, marriage and otherwise. We also have some books that I would recommend that are really great. And most important thing I would plug right now is that Professor Dr. Keltner, who teaches human happiness at Berkeley, is actually hosting a free version of this class on edX, and it's hyperlinked here. So when you get the slides, you should check that out. Even if you don't have the time to be in the class, a lot of the material we've discussed comes from that class, and there's so much more out there that you can access if you know those resources, and you have access to those resources if you check out this link here. So having said that, I think unless Yi or any of the other exec board members have anything, you all are free to go. I know you're busy and things are strenuous during these times. If you want to stick around and ask specific questions, we'd be happy to chat about them. Thank you so much for coming. And next time you won't hear me talk, you'll hear Jade talk. So hopefully that'll be fun.
Thank you guys so much for participating today.
Very quickly before everyone signs off, I just want to say really big thank you to Shantanu and Jade for running the workshop. I think they did a great job, and hopefully this discussion is a bit more refreshing than the more technical stuff that we do on a normal basis. This is something that I didn't have time to say during kickoff, but that I wanted to, the spiel that I wanted to give, which is, I think that the most important thing that you get out of ULab is not the research, and it's not the physics, and it's not the mentors. I think it's really your experience that's the most important part. And part of that is learning how to work with people and how to interact with people. And so hopefully this has been interesting. As a quick reminder, the lecture 8 checkoff is on B courses. Under assignments, it should be just like a quick 30-second thing. And then apparently there's talk of an Among Us game in the chat. So if you guys want to actually play, I can hold this room open for however long you guys want, and we can set something up. But if not, you're free.
One last thing.
Oh.
I also just want to directly thank everyone who actually spoke out. That was really great to hear from you. And one last comment on what Gurpreet shared, which is that increasingly we're seeing discussions in physics and in math and engineering about who are the people that are doing research. And perhaps you've noticed or been a part of the discussion about renaming the physics building from on to another name because of the history and political associations of the LeConte brothers. And so what Gurpreet said about who are the people that are doing research? Newton, was he good? Was he quote unquote bad, right? Things of that nature. And what are the natures of people is becoming increasingly a part of scientific discussion, as it should be. And that's one of the reasons we're holding these workshops, is we hope that you can contribute to that discussion and make change in that way, in those ways, moving forward. Oh, one last plug I guess I'll make based on that is the physics department is doing a screening or giving access to a new and really amazing documentary called, I think, about women in physics and science and their journeys, which if you want access to, you should register for. And I can send the link to register if you're interested, but would recommend. And if anyone has anything they want to ask about the research paper, about positive psychology, getting over grieving, etc., we'd be happy to talk.
Also about our experiences in physics.